Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're on a final discussion today. We'll have a roundtable discussion, and the theme will be building bridges between Europe, USA, Russia, and China. And I'll be the moderator for this discussion. We're joined by, first of all, Mr. Mark Donfried. Then we have Mr. Simon Crane. And then we have Mr. Masaharu Nakagawa. And then we have Dr. Mykola Zielinski. We hopefully will be joined by President Emil Konstantienko. Hopefully, if he joins us, then he will join us at any time, I hope. Now, the way we're going to handle that is that there will be two parts. One part will be, I'll ask each one to speak for 5 minutes. And then after that, we'll open the discussion for the floor. To kick off, I'm going to raise some questions generally, and then I'll ask each one to speak for 5 minutes, and after that we take some questions from the floor. The issues which I want to raise just doesn't have to be in the order, it doesn't have to be in the way that each one of you will be talking about, but I like to just raise some of the issues that's either in the news or in the minds of a lot of people. Number one, will global instability and imbalance among players with different economic interests result in collapse in the world economy? Or two, or will greater multipolarity lead to increased resiliency in the global economic order? Three, are we seeing two campuses of US and Europe on one side and Russia and China on the other side? Four, will regional instability, especially in the Middle East, roll over and create global insecurity? Five, will the US be able to work with new partners to create a new international system? Six, are we going to witness the collapse of the UN Security Council? And what is the alternative? Seven, is Europe aging economically? Now, as I said, I'm just throwing these just as teasers, and I will ask Mark if you can kick off. You have 5 minutes, you can speak.
All right, well, I don't think I'll use the full 5 minutes because I'm more interested to hear the other speakers. But no, you raised some interesting points as we think about actually how one can achieve a global stability. And we made reference earlier today to this idea of interdependence. And I think it's really crucial that we do accept this thesis of global interdependence. In particular, actually, Benjamin Barber and Cornel West are actually two academics based in the USA who have been the main proponents of this interdependence movement, and they actually celebrate every year Interdependence Day. Their main thesis is that for a long time in the world, nation states were fighting for independence. That was the goal. Get your independence, and then you're free. You can do what you want, and you've succeeded. The thesis of interdependence is really the opposite, that yes, independence is great, fight for it, do what you need to do. However, as soon as you're independent, you need to realize that as much as you want to be free and do whatever you want, you can't. And we actually live in an interdependent world. So when we talk about cultural diplomacy and the possible opportunity there might be in strengthening relations between the continents, I think that's the first point I wanted to make. We really do need to accept this thesis of interdependence. And I think if we accept it, then our strategies are going to automatically look a little bit different. If the goal is really to accept this interdependence, and if the goal is to work together and to cooperate, first of all, it requires humility. We have to really be willing to sometimes put our own interests actually behind the interests of the global community. And I think that's the first step that somehow has got to happen if we really want to have a working relationship between all of the powers that you mentioned, USA, Russia, and China in particular. And I think there, as you were saying, do we have a shift? And it was an interesting grouping, US, Europe versus Russia, China. I don't know. I think obviously on certain issues issues, we do see more similarities between maybe Russia and China, and on other issues, maybe more similarities between the US and Europe. So without giving you a clear answer to that question, if we're moving in that direction, my recommendation would be, if we did want to have a cultural diplomacy strategy, I would recommend in this case what I call indirect cultural diplomacy. So a cultural diplomacy that doesn't actually highlight the differences, but that actually focuses on the cooperation. So instead of having, let's say, Europe meets Russia, a forum for young leaders, which is a program that actually ICD has, focusing on European identity and Russian identity, let's have a program like Europe meets Russia, focusing on the cooperation. So instead of talking about ourselves and our cultures, we talk about actually the collaboration itself. What can we do together to help ease the situation in Syria? What can we do together to help ease the situation and improve the situation for global climate change? And by the indirect focus, sometimes it's easier for us to actually come together. And it actually makes less relevant the differences. It makes less relevant the passports, less relevant the religions, less relevant even the languages. And we can actually have a dialogue about another issue that does have an impact on us. So that's one reflection we could consider in terms of how one can have more effective culture diplomacy. So not just winning the hearts and minds of foreign audiences, not just promoting Russian culture, Chinese culture, etc., but really the focus is more on the issues themselves. As I mentioned in the opening remarks today, I really believe that hopefully cultural diplomacy will be irrelevant. And as quickly as possible, I think we do need to get beyond the cultural diplomacy and get to work. So therefore, if we can actually have the work as the center of the cultural diplomacy, all the better. And maybe in that summit that we have with Europeans and Russians or Chinese and Americans, we can actually come up with some new perspectives. We can actually inspire the next generation to take action on the important issues. So that would be one suggestion we could consider. And I'm somewhat responding to one of your 7 questions in terms of how one can come closer to not only a stability, but really a working relationship. Because I think that's a lot of the frustration of the international community. We're just standing by. Syria is a great example. We're not doing anything aside from providing guns, and more individuals are then being shot. And in the end, the Syrians are paying the price. The Syrians are suffering. And the UN Security Council is a great example of a failed structure that really is not reacting and is not able to really do anything. So that's for me the focus. How do we actually get back to work? How do we actually start step by step, even if it's at a civil society level, to have that cooperation there? And if we can have cooperation between Chinese, Russians, Europeans, and Americans on some volunteer project in the Middle East, then maybe it's a little bit easier over a few years and also over a few generations to imagine greater cooperation also at the official level. So I'll stop there with a few reflections on perhaps how cultural diplomacy might be able to contribute to the great challenge of this huge lack of cooperation, unfortunately, between the quartet. But thank you.
Now I'll shift to Mr. Nakagawa. You have not spoken today, so I'll give you the chance now to tell us how do you think, your opinion. Okay. You can say you have 5 minutes to say your views.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Hold
on 1 second. It looks like there's a problem in the microphone. Maybe should we use a separate mic?
Yeah, I think use this one.
Maybe use the other one.
Is there another one?
The theme today is that Europe, America, China, and Russia. Why not Japan? This is the beginning of the story, but
that's a legitimate question.
But as far as the world economy or stability for the future, I think it depends on the 2 main problems that how we solve the stagnation. One is the central banking system. So each section of the country now pouring the money. When central bank is pouring the money to the sectors of the banking, and it's because one of the reasons is that to devaluate their own currency, the competing in it, and then you go on like this, especially in Japan now, and started tremendous amount of money pouring into the banking system. it's insane in a sense, but they cannot be permitted to that amount pouring into the market itself. And if you continue to pouring the money like this, I think it's going to be catastrophe sometime in the future, in the near future. I think this is the risk that we are now facing. And we have to get together and think about it and how to control the currency system, the currency system for the stability of the world. This is one point. Now another one is international cooperation vis-a-vis the mother countries in the case. For instance, in Japan, like I just wanted to say tomorrow theme, one of the themes that international factories or international corporations now started to relocate their factories or manufacturing centers to China or Vietnam or some Brazil or India. And they put the money in each country and they manufacture pretty good things, transfer the technologies in these countries. But the corporation itself is flourishing in that manner and internationalizing the norms of company itself. But each factories or each company's M&As paying the tax to China, to Vietnam, and so on. And as far as the Japanese government is concerned, we are facing aging society, and we have a very budgetary limitations in the country. We need to raise the consumer tax and so on, but the corporate income is now transferred to other countries, not in Japan, within Japan. And these kind of phenomena is happening in Europe and also the United States. And in the case of the United States, the dollar is the main currency, so that the United States can control the situation and get back the money from the system of itself. But in the case of Japan or Europe or some other countries, we cannot do it within the country. So in the end, we have to borrow the money. I mean, the company, I mean, the Japanese government has pretty heavy, debt, and we cannot see the future, how to pay back this debt. No way to paying back to the people. That is the situation. Then we have to cope with this kind of international corporations and also the mother countries, how to deal with these things. This is, I think, key points that we have to solve. And also, aging society. This is a theme that I also wanted to mention tomorrow. Yeah, okay. But the Japanese society is now leading in the realm of aging society. And we need to transform our society itself towards child rearing, the environment for the child rearing, expanding the sentiment that they want to have a child and want to marry and so on. This is one thing. But another thing is that Japan has to start opening up the country for the immigration. So far, we have so closed our country. The operations of immigration, but we are not sure though we can overcome that kind of a hangover towards the immigration itself. But we have to transform our society, and so and I think same kind of things has to be thought of in Europe too.
Thank you. Yeah. You have 5 minutes to put your views and your impression of the how to build bridges between Europe, United States, China, and Russia. Can we just
Ну, перше, ми запитаємо, чи є таке поняття європейська культура?
First, we want to ask if there is such concept as European culture,
Але є поняття європейська ідентичність.
but there is a concept of European identity.
Якщо говорити про європейську культуру, то це синтез національних культур.
If to speak about European culture, so it's like combines the cultures of all the nations in Europe.
І це сьогодні є такою істиною загальновизнаною.
And it's a fact today.
Якщо говорити, наприклад, про Росію, США, Китай і Європу,
If to speak about Russia, US, European Union and China,
як ми вважаємо, русська культура чи російська культура? Як правило, Росія демонструє русську культуру. Російська – це вже синтез тих культур, які є в Росії, як багатонаціональній державі.
Russia demonstrates Russian culture, like in the whole.
А мені здається, що будувати мости треба передусім на традиціях.
I believe that in order to build bridges, we need to think about the traditions.
Це, на мою думку, це дуже вагомий, такий вагомий базисна основа.
It's a very important basement for building bridges.
Кожна з цих країн має ці традиції.
Every of those countries have those traditions.
Глобалізація, безперечно, веде до стандартизації, до уніфікації.
Globalization leads to unifications of cultures,
Але ці мости все-таки будуються на національних культурах.
but those bridges are built on national level.
Я сьогодні говорив про культурну модернізацію. Це грандіозний план, який розробляє Китай.
Today I was talking about the cultural modernization that is now in China happening.
І Китай, судячи з цієї концепції, безперечно бачить свою перспективу у тому, щоб на базі традицій збереження культурних національних цінностей будувати оцей своєрідний плацдарм для контактів зі світом.
China preserves their own traditions, and in such a way they also try to build bridges between USA, Russia, and Europe.
Якщо говорити про Росію, то Росія також будує свою, так би сказати, основу для культурного діалогу на великій і могутній російській культурі.
Russia is also basing their culture on their powerful Russian culture.
Якщо говорити про Сполучені Штати Америки, то тут більше фактор такої модерної, так би сказати, культури, яка надзвичайно активно засвоює, продукує такі новітні цінності культурні.
In the US, the culture is more modernized.
І я переконаний, що якщо дивитися на міст з обох сторін, допустимо, то та сторона і та сторона може подати таку систему цінностей, яка може створити цей міст. І вони на середині цілком сходяться і можуть витворити якийсь своєрідний синтез такого глобального культурного діалогу.
If to look at the bridge from both sides, so these both sides can cooperate with each other and build culture, like they can cooperate in such a way, like build intercultural dialogue and find understanding with each other.
Але це повинно бути, на мою думку, рішення багато в чому політичне на рівні державної так сказати, стратегії.
But it should be a political decision.
Тому що ми поки що бачимо ці культурні мости, які будуються індивідуальностями, як правило, або безсистемно часто. Вони дають свій результат, але це не той діалог, який може зблизити такі цивілізаційні центри, про які ми сьогодні говоримо.
But nowadays we see that those bridges are built not systematically.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Mr. Samakrin.
I believe that the interdependence argument in terms of how we approach globalisation, how we approach the modern challenges, is pretty well entrenched. I say that, and I want to come to processes, but I also want to come to what's been locked in. The recent global financial crisis saw a lot of countries in difficulty in terms of their own economies. There was pressure to return to protectionist tendencies. In some cases, there were examples of moving in that direction, but in the main, because the rules-based system had been put in place through the WTO, people could not go back on what they'd done. They sought creative ways to fudge certain things and redefine, but in many ways the rules-based system determined internationally was an important buffer during that economic crisis. On the process question, the difficulty we had in concluding the Doha round just before the global financial crisis hit was this tendency, this requirement under the WTO rules for nothing to be concluded till everything's concluded. So in other words, people who were countries which were unhappy with certain aspect, I don't like to say it's as strong as a veto, but nevertheless, it's very hard to get unanimity these days around every detail with 156 countries. So, I think that what we've got to look at in the context of this interdependency now is new models, either to break up the way you deal with certain components or deal with this notion of what constitutes unreasonableness in terms of objection. I think this is true in the UN as well. I go back to the second Iraq war. I was leader of the opposition Labor Party at the time, and the government of the day was prepared to go along with the coalition of the willing. I wasn't, my party wasn't, and we were opposed to joining the coalition of the willing. I was not opposed if, for example, the UN had determined we should go in. After all, that's the basis upon which we went into Afghanistan. And it's the basis upon which we went into the first Iraq war, the UN-sanctioned approach. The problem with the UN with the second Iraq war was twofold. One, the weapons inspectors hadn't been given sufficient time to conclude. And this goes to the factual base. If you're going to make decisions, it's important to have the facts on the table. And if that takes time, it's worth taking the extra time to get it. I believe that's important because this comes to the question of trust. People will accept harsh decisions of government, even if they disagree with them, if there's irrefutable or near irrefutable, evidence. That was the first question. The second question, though, was not just the veto power that, in that case, France was exercising with the Iraq War, but in terms of the broader Security Council, should we be looking for unanimity or should we be looking for a substantial majority? Now, I know you obviously can't overcome the fundamental structure on which the UN is based, but at least if you're having the dialogue and the debate and all the issues on the table, I believe, and this I would have supported on the day, if, for example, there had have been 12 or 13 in support of the Security Council, that would have been sufficient, in my view. These are judgments you have to make at the time based on the evidence, but I would have been prepared to support a decision of of the UN based on a reasonable majority, or if you like, put the reverse in place and say there shouldn't be an unreasonable veto. You should have regard to whether you think it's an unreasonable veto. And in this case, if there was the threat of weapons of mass destruction, if they could have been deployed, if they could have been organised in a way that could have got to put Israel at threat, then of course there should have been a preparedness to take action. But you had to start with the factual base first and then move to the process question. I think these are the big challenges that confront us. We've moved to interdependence. If you're going to have interdependence, whatever the complaints are about the UN, there isn't an alternative system to deal with it. What you've got to try and do is to make it work more effectively. And I think this is true with the ILO, for example. It's coming up to its centenary. I think the ILO has to move away from the workers' side being development of treaties and convention that protect workers' rights to understand the interdependence of workers in the modern economy and emphasise an economy can't be competitive unless it's got a skill base, and put more emphasis on skill formation and working with employers to develop that skill base so that you can grow the economy. And finally, in the case of the UNHCR, I've talked of this before, but if we're to solve the refugee crisis, and if countries won't sign up to the refugee treaty because it was a treaty that was written at the time of at the end of the Second World War, the circumstances have changed. If it's too difficult to get people to sign up to treaties, then develop codes of practice which countries can subscribe to, or which the UN, UNHCR in this case, identifies as appropriate procedures to be pursued in the processing of refugee status. And the other side of that equation is a preparedness on the part of countries, developed countries that take refugees, to be prepared to take more as over time as part of the global solution to the problem. So I'm a supporter of the international agencies. I think there needs to be more flexibility thought through as to how we solve the problems, but interdependence is embedded, international structures exist. Let's modernise the structures, or let's work to more effective ways in which those structures can deal with the problems.
Thank you. We're joined by President Emil Konstantinsk. He's good to see you.
Maybe we can give a brief welcome also for President Emil Constantinescu, former president of Romania, president of the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy. And Mr. President, I know you just arrived from the airport. I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you be so kind as to just maybe share a very brief reflection on this question of really where you see the cooperation going between the continents as we look at Russia, China, Europe, and the USA? Could you offer us just a few reflections on the issue?
Conflict prevention and especially post-conflict situation management require, in my opinion, a more comprehensive perspective that will develop the complementarity in global and regional bodies' activities. A balanced view should take into account the interest of not only of the different countries, like in the system of Westphalia agreement 300 years ago. The government is only representative for the people. But now, in my opinion, a balanced view should take into account the interests of different ethnical and religious communities, the state obligation and their citizens' natural rights, the conjectural and long-term interests of regional actors. Because the problem in Iraq was not in the war in Iraq or what happened post-war, in the moment when between different Iraqi people was a conflict between Shia and Sunnite and Kurds, because this conflict we have the experience in former dictatorship communist regime. In all dictatorship regime, all conflict is frozen. And in the moment of when disappear the dictator, all these old conflicts, religious conflict, ethnical conflict. Why? Because in this view it's necessary to have a vision, because it can only be elaborated on strategy or long-term strategy for peace by involving representative competent to express plural standpoint, questions and aspirations for hundreds of million people living in today's world. Political structures can be complemented by civic society structures. Only such a process to consolidate respect for people, democracy and common security may reach to depth of only people's true will give guarantee. It can create an efficient tool in setting up a new culture of dialogue and collaboration within the entire world. What happened after Arab Spring Revolution is a presence of the scene of the people without any precise ideology, like in comparison what happened in the moment of fall of communist regime. Because in that moment, all people have an ideology against former communist regime, anti-communist regime. Majority of people want to be integrated in NATO and European Union and accept capitalist way for the progress and welfare. But now, in current situation, what happened in the north of Africa, in Middle East, but in Turkey, in Brazil, each situation is completely different, one in comparison with other. The single thing is common is a new presence of people in political scene. The people want to have a power, want to be involved in what happened in the country, in the region, in the world, because now we must take into consideration the global citizens. Is a globalization create new type of communication, but also create a world where a certainty is a rules, not certainty. And completely new, different new risk appear and in the process if you want to assure a long time for peace and serious peace, we must take in consideration this new situation.
Thank you very much. I'll open the floor for some questions. You have the mic.
If you can introduce yourself also.
Yeah. Introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Jean-Paul Lenas from Luxembourg, and I have to leave in 3 minutes. But I want to share with you 3 or 4 short remarks. The first is about the notion of interdependence. I totally agree that, but this interdependence is not always well balanced. And some countries are stronger than others, and I think this will not change. And we have always, when we speak about interdependence, I think we have also to take into account the structure of power. This power can be political power, it can also be economic power. That leads me to a second remark. Where is for the moment the center of the world economy? And that is to give an answer if we have on one side Europe and USA and on the other Russia and China. A famous French historian, Fernand Braudel, he has written a history of the last 500 years, and he said, 2,000 years ago, the Mediterranean, but this is a Western Eurocentric approach, but he said, for 2,000 years, we had the Mediterranean in the middle. Then, for now around 1500, with the Portuguese and the Spanish expansion, we have the Atlantic. And he said, perhaps in the 21st century, we will have the Pacific. And I always tell my students, take a map of the world, take a scissor, cut the map in a different way. In almost all our maps, the Atlantic is in the center. So please take your scissors and put the Pacific into the center. And then take 5 minutes to think about the world of the 21st century. And then perhaps we will see that in this Atlantic, we will have very different coalitions. And perhaps if the center of the world economy will be the Pacific, I think that many things will change, and perhaps in 10 years we will speak about building bridges between other regions of the world. Regions, I say Europe, when I see the title here, I think here Europe is the European Union, because Russia is member of the Council of Europe. And as I work now with the Council of Europe, I changed also my view. And I become always very careful when I speak about Europe. I always ask, what Europe? Is it EU or is it the Council of Europe? And also former Soviet republics are also member of the Council of Europe. And my last remark is about the global contexts. And here we have global players. But I see in many countries, people fear globalization. And so they come again back to local activities, to local initiatives. I thought this was forgotten, but I see now that in villages, people gather again, and they organize fiestas and so on and so on. So I think we can take an advantage of this and develop also local initiatives, bringing people together on these levels. For example, making bridges between cities, towns, from different countries, from different continents. And I think there you are closer to everyday life. And there are some, in French you call it jumelage. That means also that you have I don't know the English word for this, but you sign agreements between cities from different countries, and they organize activities together. And I think also when we speak about cultural diplomacy, there's much culture in these exchanges. So thank you.
Thank you
also
very
for
much.
having had the opportunity to be here.
Thank you
And
very much.
I have to leave now.
Thank you. Have a
Excuse me.
safe trip. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, another question? Badr there. And then afterwards.
Thank you very much, dear panelists, for this informative.
Your name?
Yes, it's coming. For this informative panel. My name is Badr Abdeslam, and I'm from Morocco. I'm a student here at the ICD, in the master's program. If you allow me to disagree with you for a while, because when I was reading the title of this panel, Building Bridges Between Europe, USA, Russia, and China, I was expecting you to tell us how are we going to build these bridges. But up till now, I didn't hear anything about how those bridges should be built, probably because the task is really very difficult. But I also think, because there is no need to build these bridges, because the bridges are already there. I think there are bridges between the US and Russia, bridges between Russia and China, China and the US, China and Europe, and different bridges. There are economic bridges, political bridges, cultural and economic and socio-cultural, political, geostrategic, and all kind of bridges. So I don't think we need to build bridges or even think about building them because they're already there. What I think we should do is to think how to activate those bridges and make them like a round-trip ticket bridge, not like a one-way ticket. Like just, they open them when they want in order to pass whatever, vehicles they want to carry through those bridges, and then they close them when they want. So the bridges are already there. I think we need to think of how to activate them and make them a double lane, two-way bridge. That's one thing.
Yeah. Do you have a question or just a comment?
A comment. My question, yes, I'm coming to that. But that was a comment because I think I come here to the point that President the professor said is that I think we need to move on also from the status quo and only talk about the big powers, China. I think we need to think of building small bridges between those big powers, bridges that would lead to and interact and intersect other small powers in this world and make them like interactive. My question now is how can we activate those bridges and make them a double way or like two-way road? And thank you very much, and I'm sorry for being long.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Is it direct? Anybody wants to take that question, or we take two more questions, and then we can. Yeah. Okay. The lady here.
We'll stick with the mic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, hi, my name is Dalila, and I'm also from Morocco. So I wanted to a little bit come back to cultural diplomacy because we've been going a little bit all over the place. And so it's about bringing people from people that usually aren't supposed to be together or don't have the opportunity to travel and to see other places and make their own opinion about different countries, discover other cultures. I want to know how do your countries respectively deal with that? What are they trying to do to make people like, let's say, farmers, nurses, doctors, people that are not usually traveling everywhere, not politicians, because yes, obviously those people travel and discover the world, diplomats too, but I'm talking about a lower social class that usually doesn't have the opportunity to know other cultures or understand them or even know of their existence. What are your countries respectively doing in order to make things easier for more simple people, which are the majority of the world, know more about different cultures? That's my question.
Thank you. We take one more question before we go. Anybody?
I'm going to keep this one short. I'm going to see if I can break a record. My question is directed at, because Mr. Karim, you were talking about justification for some action, military action on Syria. Would you please kind of like elucidate on the logic of the United States possessing the vast majority of chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction on this planet, and this necessity of forcibly taking this minuscule amount of chemical weapons from Syria under the pretext of them having introduced those weapons in this conflict, which has not been proven one way or the other yet? Thank you.
Okay, so we have three questions. One, a big comment from our friend Badr. talking about that the bridges are already there and how actually to enhance these bridges between these countries. Then the second question, how to develop cultural diplomacy between people to people, and what is your country's experience or are doing with regard to this cultural diplomacy. And of course, the third one is regarding Syria, US, and chemical weapons. So I would try to comment first a little bit about what Badr said, and then I'll pass to you, whoever wants to participate. I think when we talk about the bridges are there, now somebody says now we're going back into the Cold War, so the relationship between the US and Russia is not the same as before. And we have seen a lot of signs of sort of indication of a Cold War indications. So yes, there were some bridges, but those bridges have been actually broken. Now this could lead to more of a Cold War, or how can then cultural diplomacy work in sorting out that problem, that bridge, and creating bridges in this one. Plus, there's two camps have been divided with regard to Syria, for example. We have seen Russia and China on one side, and then we've seen the EU, some or part, with the United States on the other side. So, in a way you're right, but in a way I think what we're talking about here is right. So I leave it for the panel. Who wants to take the first, who wants to take the second and third? President, I'll give you the chance.
Yes, we are here to talk about cultural diplomacy.
Yes.
Cultural diplomacy is a completely new approach. This is impossible to imagine cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. What kind of cultural diplomacy between Russia, Soviet Union, and the United States of Europe? Or what kind of diplomacy during Cultural Revolution in China, rejecting all type of culture. But we live now in the time after 24 years after the end of Cold War. But many politicians don't change their vision. For you, for young generation, if you want to be involved in politics or in political analysis, must know the difference between situation during Cold War and this new situation in a globalized world. Because during Cold War was very not so difficult for political decision in foreign politics, because it was black and white against Soviet Union, his zone, and United States and Third World manipulated by one and other. Was quite simple. Now it's completely, it is more and more difficult because in today's world, state can not longer be separated in blocks because the reactions rising according to different interests lead to changing alliance and opposite parts for different topics and subject. Because not only ideological reason or military reason is a single which decide politics, foreign politics. On one hand, is a reflex of the contemporary world democratization, but also of the pragmatism of government forced to respond to the needs of its own citizens, because it's not possible to disconsider opinion of citizens. Why? Because I insisted enlargement of democracy represent enlargement of peace. Why? Because during in dictatorship regime, it's possible citizen to hear at television or radio the country is in war. In democracy, it is more difficult to involved the country in the war according with separation of power. But recent, I insist, after spring, Arab Spring, the will of the people is important. The state security in this situation can no longer be perceived as a goal, but it would be considered a mean to guarantee the security of different group of citizens, people with own interests and choices. Why? Because, and I want to finish my speech, it is why? Because we need a cultural diplomacy. Why? Because we need a necessary, why? Because it's necessary political culture of security through forging mutual trust, negotiation and cooperation to identify major risk, and the creation and implementation of program for raising mutual respect. Because it's not possible a real mutual respect without cultural diplomacy slogan, understanding the other. This is a real respect, capacity to understanding the other's motivation. And why? Because it's necessary, this mutual respect, and both in countries with a high degree of risk as well as in areas with a potential for conflict, because it's a very, very difficult to understand all motivation, not only motivation of the government reason, but motivation of different group, ethnical group, religious group, social groups in each countries.
Thank you. Would you like to add something?
Talking about the cultural diplomacy, I think we usually see the active role of the private sectors in the cultural diplomacies. And people, especially, like I said before, international corporations as well as the individuals, are pretty much interested in abroad and go outside or do the business outside, and also web information of the web pouring into these countries. And these private sectors pretty much, I think, in the future go on for the interacting positive role of the cultural diplomacy. But I think the problem is government, the politics. The politics, the diplomacy of the politics is not coming from the international sentiment, but rather coming from the domestic politics. And the situation of domestic politics goes towards the outside world and specify the stance of diplomacy in each country. This is a tendency of our society right now. So in order to activize or in order to utilize the cultural diplomacy, I think government or the politics has to have to make up some sort of organization which can be more influential in international terms rather than domestic politics. This kind of a step-up process of diplomacy is necessary to utilize the cultural, I think, interdependence of each country. This is my impression. And also, like you pointed out, that many people go abroad, but they are rich people, not poor. And these poor people have to deal with the international relations or different culture. As far as I see, a lot of immigrants and also the migrant workers began to moving around the world. There is no exception, I think, of this. This is the whole situation, and the thing that we have to do is to how to coexist, how to harmonize the communities of migrant people and the domestic people get together. I mean, to live together and harmonize the society. This process of internationalization or the intermingling for the world society is very important for each government, I think. And then this is also the theme of our government too, and we began to accept pretty many foreigners, especially the Brazilians and the Chileans and some of the Chinese, now came into the Japanese society. We just start to various kind of programs how to teach Japanese to the children of these migrants and also the workers, how they treat in society as well as companies and so on, and as a community itself, how to communicate with these foreigners. And if it succeeds, I think it will be a pretty internationalized society.
Mark, you want to add something?
I'll be very brief, and then I'll give it immediately to the others. So to the issue that Badr raised regarding the bridges already being there, of course, in many cases the bridges are there. There, I would say the role of cultural diplomacy is merely to educate, enhance, and sustain that which is already there. And the assessment process that I would recommend to respond to maybe the other questions too, practically speaking, what can be done? It really depends case by case. So if we wanted to strengthen the relations between Russia and China, we would first have to say today, because obviously it changes. Something that happens today in politics can change our policy, and tomorrow we need a new policy. But really look today, how is, let's say, Russia perceived in China? How is Russia presented in China? And what is the reality of Russia? And that's where cultural diplomacy perhaps could help to try to connect some of those disconnects. But I think there I don't have a general solution. I think it depends country by country. Even within countries, obviously, you have so many subcultures. But that would be the process that I would use. So first, as you said, don't reinvent the wheel. See what's already there. And secondly, see what you're up against in terms of stereotypes, lack of information, misinformation. And then you can try to see step by step, whether it's a civil society approach or a public diplomacy approach, how one can try to strengthen the relationship and correct maybe the image that there is of the country. But there, of course, the key lesson learned, it's got to be honest and it's got to be transparent. There are many nation branding campaigns that have totally failed because the nation brand hasn't actually represented the reality. And I think that's a key lesson learned over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think there, as we were discussing with some of the speakers earlier today, issues such as human rights are also very important. We can't just discuss the easy things. We can't just discuss the nice things, whether it's jazz or design or the other aspects of culture. We also need to deal with those issues that are maybe more difficult to speak about, whether it's human rights, whether it's religion, whether it's any of those issues. So those are some reflections how one could try to make the most of bridges that are already there. In some cases, you don't have bridges, and there, of course, it is necessary to build. In most cases, there are already bridges there that, of course, one needs to try to make the most of any way possible.
Yes, I want to, I think going back to the same theme, before I take questions from the floor, I think what we're witnessing now is more of, in all the crisis that's happening in the world, what we're witnessing is more of government is taking actions, and usually it's government to government, and very little of involvement of people to people, in which cultural diplomacy could be more effective in working people to people and in such building these bridges. What we have seen in the crisis that these governments are just taking over and they're taking these decisions. And some of these decisions are not really to the interest of either people or to the interest of the global stability and peace, in which cultural diplomacy is a mean to achieve to that. My question to you is, how do you see now, with regard to this title we have, what is the role of individuals, NGOs, academicians, business, companies, etc., away from the government, how their role, or what is their role, what are the steps that they should take toward building these bridges, and if the bridges are there, how to strengthen these bridges, and how to communicate. Especially now, we're talking with the advancement of technology, we're talking about communication between people, cutting all the barriers. How would you see that? Anybody wants to start?
Well, I think I agree with the fact that the bridges exist. Here the argument is that the cultural bridge is potentially a new bridge. It's a new track, and it doesn't have to be a physical bridge. The technology today means you can have a virtual bridge, but it is getting far more of this person-to-person engagement beyond the political engagement. Secondly, how do we engage the communities that can't mobilise? I think this raises two issues. One is the role of the NGOs, because here we should be using the NGOs, using our aid monies to facilitate the NGOs to better empower the poorer communities. This is whether it's capacity building, whether it's training, whether it's the physical infrastructure, whether it's the social needs. But there is the interesting question of the people-to-people engagement too, because if we accept that the new trade agenda isn't commodities so much as services and investment flows, what's the most significant service? It's labour. And here there is obviously a lot of reaction in countries to opening the borders, whether you call it guest labour or whatever else. Now we're dealing with this in our country. We obviously allow skilled migration where the shortages exist in the country, but we allow it in circumstances in which there's also a commitment in our country to develop the skill base and enable the local population. But I think the people movements is the most difficult dimension of the future trade agenda when it comes to the perception of services. Can I make the point, though, that one of the biggest flows in the services agenda is education and training? Why is this? Because the countries that benefit from the exports are the developed countries. And it's the developing countries that are increasingly sending people to be educated in other countries, whether it's Germany, whether it's Australia, whether it's Japan, whether it's the US. So I think that we've got to understand this dynamic and try and work with it. The bridge is opened. It's a people-to-people engagement. But let's do more with it. Let's immerse the culture. Let's use the technology, and let's get the two-way street going with the education experience. Not just bringing students to Australia from China, for example, or India, but taking Australian students back, swapping the semesters and becoming virtual classrooms, either physically or through the technology. Now, the question that was about the weapons of, or the chemical weapons, can I just make the point that what I am seeking to distinguish here is the circumstance in which you have to establish the factual base. That's where the time is needed. The most appropriate body, in my view, is the international bodies to do it. The fact that other countries have these weapons is a good debating point, and it would be nice to think that we could eradicate all, just as we could eradicate all nuclear weapons. That isn't going to happen anytime soon. It's the question of how they are proposed to be used. And if they are to be used, that's the issue, not the existence of the stockpile. It's, are they prepared to be used? And in the case of the Syrian crisis, there's no doubt they were used. The question that still has to be established is who used them and how. And that's where the process that's seeking to determine that needs to be allowed to run its course. And it's the reason I think that the two parliaments in both the UK and the US were reluctant to give their Prime Minister and President respectively the authority to go, because they had been burnt the previous time in terms of Iraq. Now, I accept the arguments that there's a separate set of issues that have emerged post-Iraq. What I was addressing here was really the process by which you make the decision to go in, and that has to be developed as a team, if you like, approach, a collective approach, not just driven by an individual country. And because I think that comes to the point that the Professor was making before, that some have more power than others, and they clearly can assert it, seek to use it at the time. That's where there's got to be the balance brought in.
Thank you.